working out there's one secret ingredient. I don't care how many books you read or, how many things you see. There's one secret ingredient to working out, and that is don't quit. So whenever you want to start something, make sure you start in a way that you won't quit. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see you. For almost 30 years, I led the desert vineyard in the high desert in Lancaster, Palmdale. And when I went there, I was coming off 2 years in England where I had worked for a ministry called New Wine with David Pitches, and I had traveled all around the country. This was kind of in the aftermath of 1990 and a lot of talk about revival. And my mandate was to go to these historic churches and to talk about being fruitful, using our gifts, seeing the kingdom demonstrated, and hopefully seeing evangelism. It was during that time of doing that, 200 events in 2 years, that I felt a rebuke from God, not just for me personally, I've had those, but this was kind of over the whole church as I was experiencing it. And that rebuke had to do with, trying to think about and talk about and be equipped for winning people out there somewhere, whether it would be across oceans or down the block. And yet the people that would come through our doors towards us, we didn't do a very good job. I felt the Lord say to me, if you can't win the people I send to you, how are you going to win people that I send you to? And that precipitated for me a real change in how I thought about church, how I thought about doing church. And from that moment on, when I came to the desert vineyard and was in charge, which, that's a dangerous proposition, then you start shaping things. And one of the things I wanted to shape is that I wanted to see as many parts of what we did that would just simply be foreign and incomprehensible and a bit awkward for people who were guests. I wanted to try to mitigate that awkwardness. I wanted to try to do what I would do in my home when I invited guests there. That we would do hospitality in a very loving and graceful way. And so I looked at different ways in which people could feel awkward. One of them was that they felt awkward during the offering, if you were new. And of course, we weren't going to stop asking for money. That would just be blasphemous. But we would change the way it was done. And so early on, I began telling a joke during the offering, which some found to be really irreligious. That I wanted to remove as many of those awkward moments. Like I'll give you one this morning, right? And this may not be awkward to any of you, but a long silence at the end of worship feels very awkward to someone who's not experienced that before. It's like, it feels awkward. So we started encouraging people to applaud at the end of worship, to applaud during worship if they want, to somehow, we're what's the right word that I can use for us? I wasn't raised in church, but I was won to Christ and kind of discipled in a Presbyterian church. And Presbyterians, of course, know that they're going to be the first to be with the Lord when he returns, because it says the dead in Christ shall rise first. And we were God's frozen people, right? So just trying to mitigate, right? So I tell a joke, and all that is a setup to tell you a joke. Okay, here's an example of what I would tell. My best joke ever. This is not the joke I'm going to tell. The best joke ever was about a guy. I told this during the offering. Guy dies, goes to heaven. Peter meets him at the pearly gates and says to him, why should we let you in? The guy goes, I got nothing. So Peter tries to help him out. Like, did you do any, noble acts of service? Can't think of any. Did you do any, kind of sacrificial things for others? Not really. Did you ever give your money away? Like at church, did you ever give your money away? And the guy said, yes, there was that one time at my mother's memorial, I put 25 cents in the box in the back. Peter looks at him and says, 25 cents on your mother's memorial. And one of the angels is talking in his ear, and he turns around and they have this very animated kind of angry discussion. And then he turns back around to the guy and he says, okay, we're going to count that. The guy says, whew, what was that all about? He goes, oh, don't mind him. He just wanted me to tell you to take your quarter back and go to hell. So that was the kind of jokes that I told. That was my favorite. Here's one. A man and his wife were sitting in the living room discussing a living will. Just so you know, the husband says, I never want to live in a vegetative state, dependent on some machine and fluids from a bottle. If that ever happens to me, just pull the plug, the man said. His wife got up, unplugged the TV, and threw out all the beer. It's wrong. It is wrong, isn't it? It's wrong. But I have to tell you that how many people, this is just ridiculous, I know, what enables someone who's exploring or curious or has a wife who drags them to church, what keeps them coming? I can't tell you how many wives told me it was your jokes. And the fact we put a Starbucks in the church. We were the first Starbucks in the Antelope Valley in a community of 400,000 people. We were the very first one. It was in our church, and it was the coffee and the jokes. And so many people, because they kept coming then, would encounter Jesus. Shifting gears from something a little more lighthearted to something a little more sober. June 15th, 1904. That's very good. That's very good. You remember that. That's awesome. 120 years ago. Yeah, that's maturity right there. A Reverend Haas, who was the pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Little Germany in Manhattan. Little Germany was an area of tenement buildings and butcher shops and small enterprises. It was smelly and hot and overcrowded, as so many of the communities and immigrant communities in New York were in those days. And Reverend Haas every year would plan an outing. He would rent a big boat, big as he could get, and his congregation and community people would come out on a Saturday. They'd get on that boat and they would sail up the East River to kind of the Long Island Sound, where they would put ashore near a park, and they would spend a day in the countryside in the sunshine and the warmth, and it was something that people looked forward to all year long. So that June 15th, 1904, 1,300 people got on the General Slocum. It was a 3-level steamship, big side paddle wheel steamship. 1,300 people got up and they began to chug slowly up the East River. A beautiful day. The water was like glass, just perfect. About 10 a.m., maybe 30 minutes into their trip, little puffs of smoke began to emerge from below decks. Apparently a coal had rolled off of the boilers and fallen in amongst some straw. The white smoke was seeping out from under a doorway, and one of the children on the ship saw it and told a deckhand, who went down to investigate and made the mistake of opening the door, which fed oxygen into the room and caused the fire to grow. It still wouldn't have been perilous because they were literally 1 or 2 minutes from pulling into any of a dozen or more, jetties and places that they could offload the passengers before anything happened. The captain didn't make that choice, was afraid that if they pulled in to one of those piers, then maybe the pier would catch fire. And so full steam ahead, went up, kept going, full steam ahead. The fire grew. People began to panic. They got the fire hoses out to put the fire out, but it had been 13 years in the Tammany Hall corruption of New York City. They had only been inspected on paper, never in person. All the hoses burst, all the water uselessly poured out on the deck. They scrambled to put on too few life preservers, but they were all rotten. The few that would stay on the body, the cork in them had turned to dust. And so those people, when they entered the water soaked the cork and they became like bricks on their back and they sunk. The lifeboats had been wired to the ship and could not be undone to get the lifeboats off. 5 or 6 minutes as the fire began to spread, the captain decided that he would ram the shore, go ashore with the ship, which he did. 7 feet of water, 15 feet away from the shoreline. 1,031 people died. Most of them drowned, many of them in the fire. The largest loss of life in New York City until 9/11. 1,031 people. The aftermath of that was quite significant. There were investigations. It was both the incompetence of the crew and the greed of the ownership and the corruption of government, all to blame. But really what ended up bearing the blame for this tragedy was something more social. It's hard to imagine, especially given Olympics right now. But in 1904, most men and women did not know how to swim. And women in particular did not know how to swim because it was considered an immoral and improper activity. And so just literally hundreds of young girls and children drowned in 7 feet of water, 10 feet away from safety because they could not swim. There was a family, the Ederles, part of that German community, weren't on that boat, but they had 3 daughters, one of whom was born just a year after this tragedy. Her name was Trudy Ederle. You should remember that name, Trudy Ederle. The mother of that family, even contrary to the husband's wishes, was determined that her girls would learn how to swim. That was a big push after this happened. There was a push that people would learn how to swim. You have to understand, in the early 1900s, when you went to the beach as a woman, you wore a full wool suit with a wool hat. So if you got in the water, you were likely to drown just from the weight of the wool. But she got her daughters, and of course, most people were taught the dog paddle to swim. And we know that's an effective way to power through the water, is the dog paddle, right? The American crawl, what we know as freestyle swimming, would be invented in the aftermath of this tragedy. And one of the people who invented it was a Jewish woman named Charlotte Epstein. And Charlotte Epstein started the Women's Swimming Association in New York City. And Mrs. Ederle decided that her daughters should be a part of that and have more of an education about swimming. And Miss Charlotte Epstein taught the American crawl. Trudy was the youngest of those three daughters, and she struggled to learn it. And there's a movie produced about her life because Trudy, when she does learn the stroke, will become the most famous woman swimmer maybe in history. She will set 22 American and world records. She will win gold medal. She will win Olympic medals. And then most notably, that's between 1922, 1925, 1926, she becomes only the third person and the first woman to swim the English Channel. And she does it 2 hours faster than anyone had ever done before. She is celebrated. Her ticker tape parade in New York City is the largest to this day for an individual athlete. 2 million people came out to celebrate her after she swam the English Channel. But in the movie produced of her life, which was recently in theaters called Young Woman in the Sea by Disney, Daisy Ridley, who's star of the Star Wars series, the latest one, she plays Trudy. It's a fantastic movie. You can probably stream it on Disney+. But in the movie, they show the scene where in the Women's Association, it's just this little pool in a building. You know, the pool's not terribly much longer than the width of this room. And Charlotte Epstein is the coach, and she's walking as the girls are swimming, not very fast. And Trudy keeps shouting at. Trudy got measles as a child and is partially deaf, will grow increasingly deaf, will end her life completely deaf. And at the end of her life, she will spend herself teaching swimming to deaf children. But she's in the pool, and she's only pulling with her arms. And Charlotte Epstein stands on the side of the pool and is shouting at her, "Kick your feet. Kick your feet. Kick your feet." Because swimming, of course, is more about your legs than your arms. And when Trudy learns to kick her feet, she becomes the hero that she became. My granddaughter, Ren, who's 12, dives for Nadadores in Mission Viejo. She wouldn't be doing that without Trudy Ederle. She plays in a flag football league. She wouldn't be doing that without Trudy Ederle. We're going to look at a passage today in the book of Philippians where Paul is walking on the deck and he is shouting at us, "Kick your feet. Kick your feet." You don't know how far you can go if you will kick your feet, if you'll put some effort into it, if you'll do it, if you'll add some sweat equity to what's going on. You don't know how far you'll go. Trudy Ederle had no idea that she would go to the very pinnacle of popularity in her day if she just learned how to kick her feet. I'm going to read. You have notes there. Forgive me for the terrible title. I'm really not going to talk about, Christian jazzercise or something else. I am going to be talking about things that are going to stretch us and maybe cause us to sweat a bit. Look, Philippians 2, 12 through 18. Therefore, my dear friends, can I pause there for a second? Here's Paul writing to a church that he has a fatherly role towards, and he relates to them as friends. I don't know where we got in the church the idea that leaders should relate to people as anything other than friends. I don't know where that happened. How that happened that, well, you're this pawn, or you're this person I talk down to, or certainly isn't in the gospel. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It's so important to understand kind of fundamentally that in the Bible, whenever fear is associated with God, it is not the kind of being afraid that would cause us to draw back. We usually draw back of the things that we fear. We want to turn away, to draw back. That's exactly the opposite of what this kind of fear is meant to inspire, which is to move forward, to get close. So a scripture was read for us right after worship, that with you is forgiveness, therefore you are feared. Like, that doesn't make sense. Unless fear is something other than this idea of being afraid that would cause me to draw back. With you is forgiveness, that compels me forward. This fear and trembling that Paul speaks of in so many other places in the Bible is probably best understood as like awe and gratitude. Awe and gratitude. That is an awesome thing, God, that you have embraced and loved. It's an awesome thing coming on the heels of what Paul tells us in Philippians 2 about Christ, how he's emptied himself, how he's not considered equality with God something to be grasped, to be clutched and held on to. That in light of the enormous grace and mercy that's been poured on us undeservingly, we should have an overwhelming sense of awe and gratitude that moves us not only to draw near to God, but also to work out. To work out. For God works in, he says, you towards these good purposes. There's things to work out. There's places we need to kick our feet. Now, what those things are, boy, there'd be a lot of people would want to fill in those blanks differently. Here's how I'm going to fill them out in your notes. Having urged Christians in Philippi to embrace a unity of heart and action as they serve the gospel and follow the humility of Jesus. That's the immediate context for this passage. Paul exhorts them and us to continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. The issue of the believer's participation in the grace and good purpose of God with awe-inspired work and labor is at the forefront of Paul's mind here for himself and the Philippian church. I'm going to pause. He says he's concerned, right, in this passage, that I have not labored or run in vain. That I've not spent myself, I've not kicked my feet for no, kind of result. That's his concern. He's concerned about that for himself, for them. God is working, and we are working toward the fulfillment of the salvation Christ has won. This working out is not achieving or accomplishing something left unfinished by the work of Christ. It is putting into practice and effect that very work of salvation in our relationship with God, one another, and the world around us. As we work out issues of growth, healing, intimacy in our marriages, friendships, and faith, we must put focused effort and invested labor into realizing the full outcome of salvation by working out our, first of all, core communication. Our core communication. It's so easy in religion to skip over the fact that the goal is relationship. When Jesus is asked, what's the big thing? What's God expect most from us? He doesn't hesitate. Love God with all you are. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's relational. And so these issues of what we're working out with salvation, they seem to me quite naturally to be relational things that we work out. And anyone who's ever been married knows you have to work out communication. And it's not just because men use up all their words at work and have nothing left to say, and that women are more verbal or whatever, that stuff is about. It is essential that we work out core communication with God. This is so profound. Some of you, if you know anything about my history, I was in Kansas City for 86 to 91. Mike Bickle and I grew up together. He wanted my help when he started Kansas City Fellowship. And, this whole idea of prayer. And I spent years, 3 days, a few hours at a time each time. So say 6 hours a day in prayer rooms, prayer meetings. And I got to say that the fruit is bad. The fruit is bad. Like people come away thinking, well, I've done this great thing for God because for 2 hours or whatever, I've given voice to all these requests, all these pleas, all of these, reaches for God doing this great thing. And what I've really come away with is no greater sense of intimacy or relationship or understanding with God. Can you imagine, some of you can, but in your marriage, if the sole amount of your conversation was about this is what I want, this is what I want, this is what I want, whew, that could get hard. In a friendship, ever had a friendship that was just, this is what I want, this is what I want? We tend to call those things toxic. So is that what God wants with us? Obviously, he wants us to unveil our need. Obviously, he wants us to connect in an honest and a genuine way. But communication is not just requests. Communication is vulnerability, it's transparency, it's honesty, it's reaching for understanding. Man, I tell you, this whole thing about playing roles in marriage, like Nancy and I, we've been married 48 years. She would be here today. She just wasn't feeling very well. We've been married 48 years, and we both come from busted up homes. Her dad left her family when she was 6, and I wish my dad had left at 6. And so we had no clue. We just had no clue. The only example we had was a bad one. So we thought, well, let's do the opposite. It's not enough. It's not enough. And I wish I had understood somewhere early on that in working out core communication with the person that I love most in this world, that the end goal of that would be understanding, that I would really know her, and that she would know me. And that's the goal with God. And that should be the goal of our communication. And it requires work. Man, does it require work? Effort stretches us. I want to talk and ask and listen and confess and unveil and work at understanding. And I don't just do it once, but over and over again. We must put focused effort and invested labor into realizing the full outcome of salvation by working out, secondly, our shared tasks. Our shared task. There's some things that aren't going to happen unless we participate. That's just how God's designed it. Like I don't know about you, but I, early on in the vineyard, I thought, God, if you want to heal people, just do it and I'll watch. And I'll cheer. And I will applaud. But, no, I want you to. I hope I didn't tell you this last time. My first experience with healing at the vineyard, the very first conference done, at the church outside of Fuller Seminary, Signs and Wonders and Church Growth, and I came there from Canada where I lived, and there was a bunch of us graduates of theology that came together, and I was sitting on the back row. And, lots of powerful things were happening, which I was like, yes, great, fantastic. And then after one session, I remember somebody from the front had a word about someone had a rash, an oozing rash all over their body. Who is that? And I remember thinking to myself, well, I hope they didn't sit in my seat before, like that's how hard-hearted I was. I thought, oh my gosh, it was hot. Everybody had shorts on, And I thought, who would that be? And peripheral vision, I see this movement right to my right. And I turn, and there's this young woman, probably 20 years old, and she has stood up so excitedly, and she's waving her hand, and she has eczema from her cheeks, down her neck, all her arms, her legs, her feet. I felt bad for her. But then I really felt bad when somebody from the front said, whoever's near her, you pray for her. Right? And I immediately looked on the other side of her, hoping there were someone there, or it was me. She looks at me. So full of, I would have recognized it now. I just didn't know what it was. She was just so full of faith. She just looked at me and thought, you're going to heal me. And I stood up thinking, how am I going to explain to her when she's not healed? How am I going to let her down gently? I was so glad they'd been teaching, you just hover. You don't have to actually touch the person. You can just kind of hover near them, So I thought, I'm going to get up, I'm going to hover, I'm going to give it my best shot, and then I'm going to explain to her why she got the wrong person to pray for her. And so she just got her eyes closed, and so I, put my hovering hand up, and I said, Lord, I don't know if I got any words out. And it was like that little children's thing where you draw on the pad and then you pull the clear part up and everything goes away. It was like the clear part started. I was looking at her, and it went from her toes up to her head, and it was just like it went away. And she had her eyes closed, but she knew, because she opened her eyes, and I'd never seen this. I have never seen it to this day. Tears shot straight forward out of her eyes, over the chairs in front, just shot forward. Tears shot forward out of her eyes. And you can imagine, the awkwardness, the discomfort, the social challenge. She turned it to me like I had something to do with it. And she threw her arms around me and hugged me, and then dragged me over there was a payphone over there somewhere on the wall. And this is how far back we're going now. And she calls her mother and says, Mother, you won't believe what's happened to me. And they cried on the phone together, and I was crying, but I wasn't crying why she was crying. I was crying for the condition of my own soul. I was crying for, how many times have I been near someone and didn't just have the compassion to say, hey, can I care about you? Can I pray for you? Can I hope with you for better? Shared tasks, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them where God asks us for our participation, and we opt out. Well, I don't have that gift, or, we just have 1,000 reasons. But you know what Paul says in this passage about, I'm not going to list all the shared tasks because I wouldn't even know them all. But I will say that Paul says, he describes what comes from their faith as sacrifice and service. So whatever the shared tasks are, they don't involve rule and conquest. They involve sacrifice and service. And so wherever I'm being stretched and made uncomfortable and having to sweat because I am being asked to sacrifice and to serve, there I can be pretty sure I'm in one of those shared tasks that God is seeking to work out of me by working His energy in me. Going back to my own marriage, I wish that I figured out from the very beginning that we had a bunch of shared tasks together. And the more of those that I embraced with a glad heart, like folding laundry and making meals and buying groceries and watching the kids and getting up in the middle of the night, and that there would be joy for both of us in that. Shared tasks. We give ourselves to that. We work that out in our life. Last thing, and I'll finish. We put focused effort and invested labor into realizing the full outcome of salvation by working out our end goals. Our end goals, Paul puts it pretty high. I don't know what Charlotte Epstein thought when she was yelling at Trudy Ederle, kick your feet. I don't know if she saw Olympic champion or national champion. I doubt if she thought any of those things. Certainly not the first woman to ever, spend 14 and a half hours in the English Channel swimming it across. I can't imagine she shot so high. But here's how high Paul shoots in telling us to work out. He says, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. Our lives are meant to shine. They're meant to glow with the goodness of God, to glow with the kindness and grace and character of His love, that they're meant to glow, especially against a backdrop of so much grief, about so much hatred and fear, that we're meant to shine. The end goal, of course, of salvation is life, shared life and love with God forever. That's the end goal, and that somehow we would be working out that end goal in our lives and for the benefit of others. Yeah. I want to shine. I know that you do too. That it doesn't matter how many miles are left on our odometer, or how recently we've just begun the road trip. But this idea that I got some things to work out and I'm going to work them out. And working out there's one secret ingredient. I don't care how many books you read or, how many things you see. There's one secret ingredient to working out, and that is don't quit. So whenever you want to start something, make sure you start in a way that you won't quit. Like I would get throughout my adult life think, I really want to get in shape. And so I'd go to the gym and lift weights for an hour, and then I couldn't pick up my arm for a week afterwards. And I never wanted to do that again until I forgot about that. It's kind of like giving birth to a child, I assume. That, you forget about it far enough. I'll do that again, but you want to do it in a way that you're not going to quit, so that perseverance and consistency can bring you to the goal. And so I'm gonna work out my salvation with awe and gratitude. I'm gonna work it out with the fear and trembling of my heart towards God and His goodness. I'm gonna work it out in a way that I'm gonna be consistent, and I'm gonna be persevering through challenges or problems or setbacks or disappointments. And I'm gonna do so in a way that shines. That shines. It's a long journey across from France to the white cliffs of Dover. In the movie, they tell it so well. She's been in the water it's gotten dark. She starts at dark. It's now dark. She's been separated from her boat because of the shallows. Once you approach certain places, you can't continue. The boat can't continue to follow you. She's just gone through a gigantic field of what are those jellyfish that have just stung her raw. And she isn't sure where she is or which way is the finish line. And she's kind of dog paddling in the water again, looking around. And suddenly she sees these fires have been lit on the cliffs by people who know that she's out there. And they light these fires all along the cliff, and she begins to swim towards them. Shine, friends. Amen. Not just for our own sake, but for our sake of the people who are in the water. Amen. Would you stand up with me if you're able, and we're going to pray.